Hello, all. Um, should we get started? I know we're all grooving to the music here, but welcome everyone. My name is Jamie Feudaz. I am one of the organizers of this fabulous conference, the Gender Inclusive Language Instruction, Inclusivity in Action, our third annual International Conference on Gender Inclusive Language Instruction. I'm one of the many people who worked on organizing this event for the University of Southern California, the Center for Languages and Cultures, in collaboration with the University of Arizona. We have a lot of really wonderful presentations to get to, so I'm going to keep opening remarks very brief. But I did just want to say that we thank you all so much for coming and for participating. I know that many are hoping to get a certificate of attendance, and we will be providing those. Any participant who attends 2 or more sessions live, including the keynote addresses, will receive a certificate of attendance via email. But please be patient. It takes a little bit to go through the lists of those who have attended and send all those out, but we promise we will get them to you. And with that, to keep things rolling quickly, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague and another of the organizers of this event, Mercedes Faje Seguro, who will present our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Welcome, everyone. As Jamie was saying, we want to try to do this as quickly as possible. So we go to the talks and presentations, which is what we're all here for. So I have the pleasure to introduce the guest speaker of the morning, Dr. Kirby Conrod. And I was saying how hard it was for a Spanish speaker to say some of the words I'm going to be using in this presentation. So bear with me. So Dr. Conrad received a BA in Linguistics and Literature at UC Santa Cruz, and their MA and PhD in Linguistics at the University of Washington. Their dissertation, Pronouns Raising and Emerging in Sociosyntactic Analysis of Change in Progress around the specific use of singular they. Their recent work focuses on non-binary pronouns and the sociolinguistic approaches to morphosyntaxis. They are an assistant professor of the linguistics at Swarthmore College. Thank you very much for being with us. We would like to save questions to the end of this presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I am going to share my little screen here. Is that working okay? Can people see that? Yay.
Perfect.
Okay. So I totally will have time for questions. Actually, I'm going to try and save a lot of time for questions because I want this to be like something that we get to do some discussion at the end. But I will be talking about teaching the unknown genders. But basically, the idea is I'll be talking about doing research for language and linguistics instructors. A little bit about me, I put this as a disclaimer and positionality statement. So I consider myself a linguist rather than a language instructor because the type of teaching that I do day to day is primarily about linguistic theory. I teach a lot of syntax. I teach a lot of sociolinguistics. I generally don't teach specific language courses. A lot of my research is about describing broad typological patterns across languages right now. And that's going to be something that you see reflected in this talk. I'm white, non-binary, US-based L1 English speaker. My experience teaching a language is a little bit of, it's not that unusual. After undergrad, I went to Taiwan and taught English for, I call it a gap year, but it was actually 3 years, with basically no training, and learned how to teach kind of on the job. And that was before I returned to the States to do a doctoral program in linguistics. And so my experience teaching language is this very sort of free form, figure it out as I go kind of trial and error, which is, I think, an experience that a lot of people have in this particular trajectory. Um, but it is something that is kind of informs how I teach linguistics now. Also, my experience in language classrooms as a student in high school, I took language classes, but did not acquire the language that I was trying to acquire in college. I took language classes, but they were of languages that I had no intention of actually speaking. So I was taking a lot of Latin and reading a lot of Latin, but not really like doing Latin conversation in it. And post college, my best language classroom experience was actually while I was living in Taiwan when I took some immersive classes to try and get my Mandarin to be actually functional. And that was something where I was in classes 3 to 5 hours a day. And none of the other students had the same L1 as me. So we had to use the target language to interact with each other. And it was quite an experience. So this is all just sort of contextualize where I'm coming from. But this is something where I have not, as a post grad, taught language professionally. So I'm coming at all of this as a linguist. But this is a problem that a lot of people come to ask me about after I give a linguistics talk about non-binary linguistics. Language teachers, but also just folks, people who are linguists, but also people who have taken language classes or know somebody who's taking a language class will come and ask me what languages other than English do with non-binariness. And this is a problem that I see sort of brought up in the context of language classrooms and language teaching, where if you're a non-binary student in a language class, or if you're a teacher who has non-binary students in your language class, if the target language has very binary gender embedded in the linguistic structure, and this can be in the morphosyntax of the language or the vocabulary of the language or gendered styles of speaking in the language communities, then that's going to be very hard on non-binary, genderqueer, trans students. Um, this is also an issue where there are a lot of languages where there's just no published linguistic research on what are non-binary speakers of the target language actually doing. And this is also a problem where people report that their textbooks or their teaching materials assume binary gender as a default setting, and that this is something that can be distressing to students and frustrating to instructors. Just as one example of, people expressing this kind of frustration, and this is, an example I found very quickly and easily, but this is an example of the kind of discourse that you see about language instruction in a lot of different places and about a lot of different languages. Language teachers have this kind of bad habit sometimes of saying, oh, well, this language doesn't really do that, which is usually false. But you see this a lot. So this is from a Reddit post where somebody is talking about their teenage non-binary child who's struggling in a French class, and the student is feeling like there's no place for people outside the binary. And so this person is posting on the French subreddit, or actually rather the non-binary subreddit, asking, hey, French speakers, what do people do for non-gendered pronouns or general culture terms? And the responses on the Reddit are people saying stuff like French isn't great for that, or, I'm not fluent, here's this pronoun, but unfortunately for endings on words, there's just nothing you can do. Or you can switch it up as often as possible, which is a strategy. But this framing of this being an unfortunate thing or something that the language is somehow deficient and can't express is something that I think is linguistically inaccurate. People can and do express genders outside of the binary in French, as in, I mean, as far as I know, every language. It's just that the sort of normative teaching materials that people have access to in the language classroom don't necessarily reflect that linguistic reality. Um, and so one of the things that I want us to be really thinking about when we're thinking about how to make our language curricula more inclusive, more expansive, more adequate for actually describing what people are doing is I want people to be thinking about this from day one of the first level of language class, from absolute beginners. I don't want you to treat queer language as an advanced topic where students have to struggle and misgender themselves before they can finally unlock non-binary or queer language. That's something that it kind of puts an unfair burden on queer students. And I think that this is something that we can really start from day one. The other thing, and this is just a sort of straightforward reminder, as an instructor, you can't necessarily tell who is trans or non-binary just by looking at them. And also, you might have students who don't know yet that they are going to be trans or non-binary in some way. And, incorporating this as part of your language curriculum is really important for people who have a life trajectory after your class or during your class sometimes. Where you want to be ready for somebody to be like, I'm trying out some new gendered morphosyntax this semester. You don't know on the first day of the semester if that's going to happen with somebody. And it's also really important to be including information about this and really engaging with it from the beginning of language instruction, even if you are somehow certain that there are no trans students in your classroom, because you also don't know who has a non-binary family member who will come out later. And also, it's just good to normalize it. It doesn't need to be a big deal, but it does need to be part of the sort of ground floor that we're bringing people in on. So my proposed solution is that we use the power of linguistics. And this is what I'm going to call sort of the grassroots research part, where I am going to talk about the types of student-led linguistics research, instructor-led linguistics research that can be something that is part of language classrooms, where you can assign a linguistics research project as part of your Spanish 1 curriculum. This is something that I would be really excited to see more of. And if you don't know what speakers are doing, you can do linguistics research. And I'm going to talk about some sort of practical approaches to that. And I'm hoping that this is also something that connects students with the users of the target language that they're trying to learn. And I'm also hoping that we can figure out how to analogize from existing linguistics research, even when the research isn't necessarily about the language that you are teaching or studying. You can still figure out strategies for how to talk about queer language and how to talk about non-binary language when there's not data on the language that you're interested in. So a little bit about sort of starting from what I'm looking at part of the linguistic structure. I want to talk about what parts of the linguistic structure can mark gender and sort of what should we be looking for. And I want to talk about some strategies that languages use for changing how they mark gender. And the goal is I want us to be looking to figure out what languages already do with gender so we can figure out what we want to do when we are teaching languages. And that might involve changing things, or it might involve just partaking in changes that are already happening. So um, one of the ways that languages mark gender is just on lexical elements. This can include common nouns, where like the gendered valence of the English word man versus guy versus dude, these all are gendered words and gendered ways of referring to somebody. They have slightly different gendered meanings. And it's something that you can talk about directly when you're teaching language of like different gendered ways of talking about people. A specialized version of this includes stuff like kinship terms. So talking about kinship terms frequently are very gendered, even in languages that have no morphosyntactic marking of gender. And talking about how people use gender neutral kinship terms in the language of interest is really important. So this is something where in English, people will talk about their sister versus their sibling. And then there's this sort of analogical extension that I'm aware of where people will talk about, instead of nieces and nephews, the coined term is nibbling, which I find very cute. But it's also worth talking about, like, this might be a weird word to use to refer to an adult. So this is something that you can have conversations about and sort of investigate what your language is doing with that. A huge one is also going to be relationship terms, and these are, I'm sort of assuming, romantic or other relationships that aren't necessarily family relationships. This is something that I always found really challenging in my experiences as a language student, is that people were not giving me vocabulary to talk about how my romantic or personal relationships actually worked. And so I want to be looking for gender neutral ways of talking about my partner, my spouse, but also terms for queer relationships that are not necessarily in a monogamous heterosexual framework, like a metamor or a queer platonic partner? How does your language talk about these kinds of relationships that are outside of the norm? Likewise, I think it's really important to look at queer identity labels, and this is going to be something that's culturally really variable. So, it's also going to be terms that are probably highly contested. Um, among the community, and the differences are going to be kind of subtle. So the differences in English between describing somebody as non-binary or agender or genderqueer or gender fluid, these are all overlapping terms, and the subtle differences are going to be something where different communities are going to have different understandings of what those words mean and why they are using those labels over other labels. And it's important to sort of talk about that. I think it's also important to talk about names and how people get sort of gender vibes off of names. This is something where when I was studying as a student, studying Mandarin, I was given a Chinese name, and it's a very, very gendered name. And I'm a different gender than that name is now. And this is something where I'm now sort of still keeping that name because it's a fun, like, gender nonconformity marker for me. But it's something that's worth discussing when you are doing naming practices in classrooms. So this is like a big sort of area of things to look for. Is just like, yeah, words have gender, words have gendered meanings. And when you are evaluating your curriculum, when you are evaluating your teaching material, thinking about how words convey gender and reflect gender can be really important. The other thing, and this is something I get asked about a lot, is what to do when there's morphosyntactic marking of gender. So this is frequently referred to as grammatical gender. I like to refer to these as noun classes because I think that's more linguistically accurate and less confusing. But these are when there is morphosyntactic marking that's referring to non-human stuff and is not actually referring to social gender. It is a noun class system, but it can sometimes mismatch with social gender. So for example, Vrach in Russian is a masculine word, but frequently will refer to women because many, many doctors in Russia are women. And so there's a bunch of morphosyntax that happens when you're using a masculine noun to refer to a feminine person. And that's something that people do teach in classrooms, but you can think about how those agreement patterns are going to come up. And then the other agreement patterns that you're going to see might be based on either this grammatical gender, the noun class system, or social gender. Like, is this person a man? Is this person non-binary? And when you have agreement patterns, you can show agreement markers on verbs, on articles, on adjectives. Basically, any part of speech it can have kind of agreement with morphosyntactic gender. And so the question that you should be asking yourself is, what do non-binary people do in languages with morphosyntactic gender agreement? And I'll be talking a little bit about what we know about what people do, but a lot of it is an open question right now. It's an empirical question that we actually don't have good documentation of the answer for a lot of languages of, like, what are people doing? We haven't checked yet. So one of the things that I'm going to sort of be asking us to do is, like, let's check. Um, And then sort of the last way I want to mention of ways that you should look out for gender in language is what I call gendered ways of talking, where this is not necessarily inherent gender in a word, like lexical gender, and it's necessarily morphosyntactic gender. It's more about social norms and linguistic practices that are gendered. And so this is something where you're going to want to worry about honorific titles. In German, the norm is to put a gender marker on top of the professional title, and so I don't want to be called Herr Doctor. I would like to just get rid of that hair. I don't want that. I got the doctorate so that I had a gender neutral title, is the joke. Um, and you also want to be thinking about honorific pronouns that have gendered meaning, even though they are not inherently gendered. So, for example, I don't actually know what first person pronoun I would use in Japanese to try and give people an idea of what kind of gender I'm trying to give off. You also want to be looking at discourse markers. And so thinking about stuff like, is it masculine coded to say dude as a discourse marker. And this is something where there's lots of research about this in English, but there's not a lot of research about it in a lot of other languages, where it's going to be probabilistic, not categorical. So it's not the case that only men say dude and women never say dude in English. And it also depends on where you are and what the context is. So this is something that you want to be looking for. And then there's also lots of other gendered linguistic practices like intonation or pitch or creaky voice, or how many fillers like or like I use, how I use hedges, how I do turn taking, how fast or slow I talk, do I use tag questions. These are lots and lots of linguistic patterns that, again, are not going to be categorical. It's not men do this and women do this. It's men do this 70% of the time and women do this 40% of the time overall, but you can find individual men and women who are in the overlapping distributions. And that's something that I think it would be really great if we had just more awareness of those overlapping behaviors as well. So I want to talk about what strategies I have documented that languages are already using to do non-binary language. Just a preview, this is kind of the meat in the middle of the sandwich of my book that I'm working on. And the other note that I want to say about this is that language contact phenomena, which includes stuff like loanwords and calcs, but also translanguaging or code switching or code blending strategies, are going to show up in all four of these options. But I have identified sort of four main strategies that languages use, and I want to talk about them because I think that if you don't see your own language of interest in this list, you will still probably notice, oh, I think I've seen somebody do this strategy in my language, even if it's not documented yet. So I want to go through these. The first option, the strategy that languages use, is recycling. So this is when there is a form in the language that already exists and is being used for something that is similar to, but not exactly, non-binary. And over time, languages can recycle this form. This can be a word or a morpheme or a construction by expanding or changing how it can be used. And they can change the semantics of the word slightly, or they could change the morphosyntax of the word slightly, or both. My example, I think that the morphosyntax and the semantics both changed a little bit. So singular they, it has been around in English for a very, very, very long time. And the very old use of singular they is in gender neutral, singular, generic, or indefinite or non-specific context. So this is something like each student brought their own snack, where there refers to each individual student. This is sort of a quantificational, indefinite situation. I am not talking about a specific particular student. This singular they has existed in English. It's been antedated back to Middle English. It shows up in Chaucer. It shows up in Shakespeare. It's super, super old. And pretty much everybody in the studies that I've done has found it to be acceptable. When people don't like this very old singular they, it's usually because they have like a prescriptivist lean towards using a generic he instead. And that's a whole kettle of fish that I won't get into. But the point is, this has existed for a long time. It's been accounted for a really long time. This has been recycled into a couple new uses. One of the new uses, and this is probably a little bit older, is using they for a singular antecedent that's gender neutral, but it's definite, but I'm kind of being intentionally vague, either because the person's gender is irrelevant, or because I don't know the person very well, or because I can't tell their gender. There are various reasons why I might use it, but I can point to somebody and say, that student forgot their snack. And that student does not necessarily have to be a non-binary person. And if you start paying attention, you're going to notice this everywhere, all the time. People constantly do this. But as far as I can tell, it's within the last 100 years that this has started being a thing. The other new use of singular they is as a non-binary specific pronoun. So when I point at a person and I say, Kirby forgot their snack, I know what gender Kirby is. It's the non-binary one. This is not generic. This is not indefinite. I'm not being intentionally vague. I'm not obscuring Kirby's gender. I know the gender, and my interlocutor might also know Kirby's gender. The they is a way of saying the gender is none of the above. And so specific non-gendered is the new use, whereas sort of this indefinite non-gendered use is the old use. So far, I actually have not found other languages that have used this straightforward of a recycling process of like, we already had this laying around, but let's just use it for non-binary stuff. English singular they is actually the only example of this really straightforward recycling that I've found. But like I said at the beginning, contact phenomena like loanwords can also combine with all of these strategies. So if you, for example, are going to borrow a gender neutral pronoun from your neighbor and then start using it for non-binary stuff, that would count as kind of like, well, I'm borrowing it and then recycling it. So I'm going to sort of mention these like combinations with contact phenomena throughout. Strategy 2 is one of my favorites. This is the chapter I'm working on right now. This is analogical extension. This is extending a pattern that already exists in the language into places where the pattern wasn't previously applied. The idea of the analogy is kind of it's A is to B as B is to C. There's this meme account on social media that posts 4-part analogies. And I just pulled my favorite one off their first page. Step 1, progesterone, step 2, progester 2, where the idea is like, well, they've just replaced the 1 with the 2 to extend the pattern. I found it funny. So the idea is that when a pattern already exists in a language, it can be extended to other places. And so my favorite example of this, there are a number of examples that I've seen, but my favorite one is the Spanish A endings. So this is just based on the observation of like, okay, in words like chico or muchacho, the O is a masculine ending, so O must mean masculine. Obviously, it is more complicated than that, but this is like a very, very like rough overall trend. Chica is feminine, profesora is feminine, so A is a feminine ending. Estudiante is not inherently gendered. You can have la estudiante or el estudiante. You can have presidente with la or el. And so essentially what happened was that people who are L1 speakers who are non-binary have been like, well, this A ending is gender neutral, so A is non-gendered. Once you apply and extend that pattern, you can essentially decide, I can now replace O or A endings with A endings. So I can get chique or profesore or amigue. There's like some spelling stuff that's happening there. But the idea is the pattern already existed in the language, and the linguistic change that happened is just, I'm going to extend this already existing pattern. This is something where there's a lot of already discourse and conversation about this particular pattern in Spanish, and whether it's like good or not, prescriptively speaking, but linguistically speaking, empirically speaking, people are doing this. And so when we're looking for strategies of how languages can do this, this seems to be one of them. Another strategy that I find really fun, I really like this strategy, it's so good, is that languages can blend words. And that's like smushing together breakfast and lunch to make brunch. But languages can also blend morphemes. And so my example of this is German role nouns. So Künstler is a masculine singular artist. Künstlerin is a feminine singular artist. The masculine plural and the feminine plural are marked differently. And the Künstlerinnen ending is like, okay, I've got the feminine ending, and then I'm also going to go ahead and put a plural ending. But one of the things that has been happening in German is that people have been using this dot form or star form to show a gender inclusive plural. And this is something that's common when people are trying to say, write a job ad that's not sexist, of like, I want to hire an artist and I don't particularly care if the artist is male or female, or I want to talk about all artists, but saying artist masculine and artist feminine is like really cumbersome. So I'm going to smush these words together. And that dot or that star essentially is a way of showing it's Künstler plus, Künstler, I shouldn't have clicked, Künstler plus Künstlerinnen. And there's been some research showing that when people are reading these forms out loud, when there's a dot or a star, they actually kind of pause there, which I think is really interesting. And then you can also do a little bit of extending the pattern a little bit backwards to say, okay, well, I'm going to just do that with the singular as well. I can do Künstler and Künstlerin and put the star there to show I'm talking about the masculine form and the feminine form at the same time and kind of get this neutral singular. Once I have a neutral singular, I can either be like, okay, this neutral singular is about trying to be inclusive, trying to say, I want to hire an artist, I don't care what gender. It's also a way that people can refer to non-binary people without misgendering them. So I super, super love these blending or stacking examples that languages are sometimes taking up. I have not seen a lot of examples of them, but I've seen a few. And this is just one of my favorites. The fourth strategy that I'm aware of is pragmatic strategies. So there's a mix of pragmatic strategies that people can use. And this is stuff like avoiding gendered forms by sort of talking around, changing the sentence or paraphrasing to try and avoid the parts where you would have a gendered form. Mixing and matching gendered forms, or using sort of non-traditional gendered forms that are counter to what your interlocutor might expect. Ort Berchtling's chapter in Queer Excursions documents genderqueer Hebrew speakers. Hebrew marks the gender subject agreement with first person on the verb. And so Berchtling's speakers did a couple of these pragmatic strategies. One of them was just, I don't use that verb tense. So there's a whole tense that you can just completely avoid to avoid gendering yourself. Another one is, and this one sounds just incredibly cognitively difficult, but I was fascinated that people were reporting this, alternating every other verb of like this verb, I'll do masculine agreement. And then the next sentence, the next time I hit a verb, I'll do feminine agreement, and just switching back and forth. And then the other strategy that speakers in Berchling's study did was they said they would just use whatever the opposing gendered form was from their assigned sex at birth to try and counteract the way that people were gendering them generally. And so if somebody was assigned female at birth and other people were generally gendering them as feminine, then they would use masculine as a way to sort of push back against that, as a way of creating a genderqueer identity by creating this tension in a discourse where two people are using two different gender markers. So these strategies are something that you might encounter in basically any language that has any gendered forms. It's something that I mostly talk about a way of giving us sort of expectations of what to look for. But the next thing I want to talk about is how to look for it. So this is my like, let's do grassroots research part. I want to talk about how to investigate what's going on. I'm going to give us some ideas for short informal online surveys. I'm going to give us some ideas for short informal elicitation interviews. And I'm going to talk a little bit about research that is student-led and research that is instructor-led. Short informal online surveys can be something like an acceptability judgment survey, a fill-in-the-blank survey, and they have a lot of advantages. One is that it's just easier to get more people to take the survey. You can get actually kind of a large N if you get shared by the right person on social media. You can get 100 respondents in a day. And it's something that can give you kind of a bird's eye view or a broader perspective of linguistic variation and the language that you're interested in. And there's also a variety of ways to sort of ask the question. So you can ask like, hey, how natural does this sentence sound to you? You can ask people to fill in the blank of like, here's a sentence and here's a blank. What do you do there? You can also give people forced choice answers of like, okay, of these possible multiple choice answers, which one sounds the best to you? You can also do something like short text answers. There are a few disadvantages with short online surveys like this. One, it is harder to get at subtle stuff and you need to be careful about good design. where if you are trying to, for example, get people to do something about non-binary reference, you need to make sure that they understand that that's what you're doing rather than gender unknown or gender neutral reference, which is slightly different. It's also harder to get something like acoustic or phonetic data. So if you want to know exactly how people are pronouncing the Künstlerin star form, that's going to be harder to do on an online survey. It's possible, but if you're letting people use their like phone microphones, you're going to get bad acoustic data. And you know, it's sort of a toss-up of whether that's something that more participants can sort of overcome. The other thing with these short online surveys is you don't know for sure why somebody's answer is what it is. So this is always an issue with acceptability judgments. I do a lot of acceptability judgment surveys, and the question is, hey, does this sentence sound natural to you? And sometimes the answer is, this sentence sounds weird because of that weird pronoun that you used. Yes, that's what I was looking for. But sometimes the answer is, this sentence sounds weird because why would an artist go to an opera? And it's like, okay, well, that's something that I wasn't interested in. And there's only so many ways that you can totally control for that. So there's pros and cons to this kind of thing. But here's an example of one thing you could do is say, okay, I want to know how productive the A ending is in Spanish. I want to know if there are certain person referring nouns that speakers are more or less likely to accept with the A ending, and do they extend this pattern to novel or unfamiliar form nouns? So I'm going to do a short forced choice survey. I've written in this in English because my Spanish is not full sentence level competent. But you can say, okay, what's the best way to refer to this genderless alien who is the species a wug? And you can choose between wug with an A ending and some other options, including wug with an O, an X, which is an orthographic X, is something that you see sometimes in written Spanish to indicate gender neutrality. And then I have kind of this distractor choice of wug with a Y, which I expect to be kind of surprising or strange in Spanish to most speakers. This plus some basic demographic info, people can take it in 5 minutes. You can get a bar graph out of it, and you can get a really good bird's eye view of what are people doing, what will people accept, and that can inform your language teaching. Um, this is a free idea to a good home. If you want to take this wholesale, please do. I'm so serious. I want to contrast this with something like short elicitation interviews. So these also have advantages and disadvantages. One advantage, you can get more insight in subtle distinctions from speakers. So you can sit down with somebody and say, okay, let's take aside from non-binary people. Let's talk about like an imaginary Star Trek alien species where they don't have gender. How do we talk about this one individual person who is definitely a person and doesn't have gender? And you can also contrast that with, well, how do you talk about non-binary people? Do you have non-binary friends? You can get a lot more sort of social and personal information to contextualize what you're talking about. You can also target particular kinds of speakers. So for example, maybe you're interested in not just non-binary people, but trans femme non-binary English speakers who are living in the UK who might have different language practices than a trans femme non-binary person living in the US. And it lets you have a lot more meta-linguistic discussion and learn more community knowledge about what people are doing, why they're doing it, what they like, what they don't like. The disadvantages are mostly logistical. It's harder to scale up and get lots of people. It takes longer. It's more of an imposition on people's time. You have to transcribe the interview usually. If you transcribe it automatically, you have to hand correct it. Transcription takes a long time. If you don't transcribe it and you're taking notes, that still takes longer. And you also get less perspective on big overarching patterns of variation. So talking to one or two non-binary people is really, really great, but it doesn't necessarily let you know how generalizable your findings are. But I think that in combination, these can be really, really powerful ways of just being like, what's everybody up to? That's really the question, is what is everybody up to? Oops. So here's an example of a short elicitation interview. My question is, how do Russian genderqueer speakers navigate grammatical gender? I'm going to just interview my friend Lev, who is a trans non-binary diasporic Russian speaker who's been living in New York City since childhood, but speaks Russian with their parents and frequently visited Russia before about 2020. We stopped visiting Russia around 2020. The method is just let's sit down and talk, but I have a tape recorder. This is something that can be really, really wonderful because I not only get perspective of like, what are you doing with grammatical gender? Do you do different stuff at different times? What do other people do when they're talking about you? But I can also get more context about like, how do your parents do this? Like, do your grandparents get this? What are your other trans friends doing, where I can get more social information, and that can be really, really illuminating and important. Um, so how do I turn this into a classroom practice and into a teaching practice? So one possibility is student-led research, and I wanted to share a couple things that I do in linguistics classrooms that I think would work really well in language classrooms. I think that you can incorporate a small-scale linguistics research project into a language class as something like a term paper or a term project. I always scaffold term projects. So I ask for like a prospectus, an annotated bibliography, an outline, a rough draft, a final draft, like lots of little bits. The reason for that is it gives me more opportunities for giving them a lot of feedback, and it also lets them develop the project over an extended period of time rather than I mean, it's mostly a way to stop my students from procrastinating and writing the whole paper the night before it's due, and I tell them that. But this is something that I think would be really exciting with intermediate or advanced students to do in the target language, because it would be a very immersive, very like connecting experience to be like, I am going to write a survey in the target language. I am going to analyze a survey in the target language. I am going to write my report in the target language. That would be a huge achievement for a second language learner who is trying to develop this language. I also really like ungraded group projects as in-class activities. This is something where I don't like graded group projects because of, the students get into drama. But I really like doing in-class group activities, and I have a small one and a big one to share. My small one is something like, okay, today I want each of you to get into groups, and your group is responsible for a single slide on a topic. And that's what we're doing in class. I want you to be researching or developing something on just one slide, and then we're putting them together into a class presentation at the end. And the topics can be like, okay, what are some versions of like how people are talking online about non-binary and genderqueer identity in the target language or something like this. The other thing that I really like doing, and I've done this a couple times in a sociolinguistics class, is that the entire class, and so this has usually been about 20 people, collectively designs and runs the survey together. And this is an experience where it takes a few weeks of in-class time from developing the research question, developing the survey, distributing the survey, and then analyzing the results. But it gives them an experience that's a lot more like managing a large lab research project. And it's something that's very similar to what professional sociolinguists do. So I really like doing it. Like I said, it takes a few weeks of in-class time, but it gives you a lot more of an opportunity to sort of guide them through the process. And this is all interaction that, again, can be happening in the target language if that's something that you're ready to do. The other thing I want to mention is that for any of these types of projects, I really like encouraging undergraduate students, especially, to submit to linguistics research conferences. There's a lot of really, really amazing small local student-run conferences that are usually run by grad students. And so the undergrads feel really cool when they go to a conference, and the grad students love when there's a bunch of undergrads at a conference because it makes them feel cool and important. And the other advantage, in addition to like I think undergrads should get to experience a research conference just to see what it's like. It makes the work citable and it shares it with the research community. So if you are doing this kind of in-class activity where you're like, oh, we found out that like some genderqueer Russian speakers are doing this thing, sharing that information means that the next person who is worried about like, what do I do, can find the information that you shared and they can build on it. And I think that's really exciting and great. It's also really great to involve students in like the knowledge creation process. On the side of like instructor-led research, I think that the thing that I would worry about the most is how on earth do I find the time to do an additional research project on top of my teaching load? And so my pep talk here is all about keeping it manageable. My first suggestion is to keep each project extremely small and targeted. Look at just one thing and remember that like because this is such an unexplored area in linguistics research, anything you can do is huge. I also think it's really important to share small updates with, in linguistics, they're called squibs, but like short papers, sometimes called research reports that are like 5 pages long. This is something that a lot of journals do that I really, really like, and I wish we would do more of them. Or conference talks. Something like a huge journal paper can take years. Not everybody needs to write a huge journal paper to progress in their career. And so if you're an instructor who's like, I'm a grad student, I'm an MA, I don't need to be doing research. This is kind of a fun bonus thing. Don't write a research paper that takes 3 years and that's 60 pages long. Write a 5-page paper that's a research report that says, I did a survey, here are the results. Okay, bye. And then I get to read about it. That's all I want. um, the other suggestion is to get your friends in on it. Many hands make light work. I also would love to see more collaboration between language instructors and linguistics researchers. And so I think collaboration, it would be a really huge tool to make this more manageable. I also think incorporating it directly into classroom practices and publishing it in venues that are focusing on education studies. I mean, linguists read these too. I want to see more stuff in an education journal that's like, I did this research project, and also this is what we found out about genderqueer Hebrew. I'd be like, yes. Also, I think that you can legitimately consider it as a type of teaching prep. Researching the topic that you are teaching is teaching prep. And so if that's what makes it easier to incorporate it into your workload, I think that this is super important to do. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention is just a really quick word about safety and privacy when you're doing this kind of research. I think that some of this is something that would need to be covered by an IRB. I think keeping studies very small is something that will also make your IRB process easier. But I just wanted to share this anecdote. When I was in graduate school working on Singular They, I asked my advisor, who is Polish, well, what do non-binary Polish speakers do? And she said, well, they mostly speak English. And I was like, well, right, but what do they do in Poland? And her answer was like, hopefully get out of Poland. And that was her answer about a political situation that she saw that was like really, really hostile to queer life. But I think it's important to remember, okay, there are queer people everywhere, but where places where being queer openly is unsafe, you have to be really careful to balance the needs of privacy with your sort of scientific need to know what's going on. If you're going to do research in a language community where you have reason to believe that it's super queerphobic, getting teammates and making a longer project of it can be good to let you sort of do it right. And also be careful to like funnel resources back into the community. Ask people there what they want and need, and make sure that your research is actually serving the people that you're working with. The other thing I will say is that diaspora language users are still real users of the language. So my friend who is Russian speaker living in New York City is a real speaker of Russian. It's okay to talk to them to describe their language practices, build linguistic knowledge with them, and incorporate their knowledge into your language teaching. It's not like less authentic just because they are not living in their country of origin. And I think that this is especially important when you are trying to work with queer people, to acknowledge that queer people sometimes will be sort of the first people to leave when stuff is getting bad. And frankly, we're seeing some of that stuff in the States right now as well. So, you know, so I just want to sort of put out this call of like, what should we all be doing? And generally what I want is for us to be honest about the limits of our knowledge and include students in the knowledge making and knowledge sharing processes. I also want us to be straightforward about the realities of language variation. There's never going to be one right way to do anything in language. And the best thing is to offer people a variety of strategies, and also be upfront about the fact that queer language often comes with stigma and prejudices. Give them information about how forms will be received by different types of people, and infuse your materials with queerness and queer stories without always pointing it out or making a big deal with it. I think just having some sort of background characters in your running like soap opera that are that are gay and it's not discussed, that would be great. And also talk more about how linguists learn about how language works and what we do and don't know, because there's a lot of stuff that's like, well, we just haven't documented that. Probably people are doing something, but we haven't written it down yet. I'm gonna skip this slide. This is just my slide of like, this is a good thing to do, please do it. But basically what I want to say is like learning by doing is good, connecting with people is good, language varies and changes, and misgendering is bad and impedes learning. And also, the language classroom historically has been and sometimes still can be a site of prescriptivism and imposing hegemonic language standards. Prescriptivism is, I mean, it's an intense ideology that sometimes involves just like lying about what the language actually does. And I want us to all get out of the habit of lying to students. This is something that it's a conversation that I'm having with other syntacticians a lot right now. Um, and incorporating queer language practices into your language classroom is about repairing the harm of previous erasure. And I also just generally want linguistics research to be something that people feel empowered to do. You don't need a license. You can just do this. And you can tell us what you found. And that's it. And I have a lot of people to thank, but I am a little bit past where I want to be on time. So I want to move on to my slide where I'm taking questions. Thank you so much.